How tariffs are reshaping American factories, a focus on fashion's new home and industry-wide transformations. Introduction. In 2025, tariffs have emerged as a transformative force in American manufacturing, reshaping supply chains, production processes, costs, and economic output across various industries. The Trump administration's aggressive tariff policies, including a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico, up to 60% on Chinese goods, and 50% on steel and aluminum, have disrupted global trade dynamics, prompting companies to rethink their manufacturing strategies. While these tariffs aim to bolster domestic production and reduce reliance on foreign supply chains, they have also introduced significant challenges, including higher input costs, supply chain volatility, and the need for operational restructuring. This analysis delves into the apparel industry's response to these tariffs, encapsulated in the concept of fashion's new home, where apparel brands are increasingly reshoring production to the United States to mitigate tariff-related costs. Additionally, it explores how tariffs and supply chain disruptions are transforming manufacturing processes, costs, and output across industries, with specific examples of how tariffs on Chinese imports have spurred U.S. steel production and driven investment in domestic semiconductor manufacturing. The discussion includes real-world case studies, economic data, and strategic insights to provide a comprehensive understanding of these shifts. Fashion's new home, reshoring in the apparel industry. The impact of tariffs on apparel manufacturing. The apparel industry, long reliant on low-cost manufacturing in countries like China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, has been profoundly affected by the 2025 tariffs, particularly the 25% to 60% duties on Chinese imports. These tariffs have significantly increased the cost of imported textiles and finished garments, prompting apparel brands to reassess their supply chains. According to a 2025 survey by the National Association of Manufacturers, 30% of small and medium-sized enterprises in the apparel sector reported cash flow issues due to tariff-related cost increases, pushing many to explore domestic production options. Historically, only 2% of clothing purchased in the United States is manufactured domestically, with half of that production dedicated to military contracts mandated by law to use U.S. manufacturers. However, the rising cost of imported garments due to tariffs has made domestic production more economically viable. For example, a post on X estimated that a 400% tariff on Chinese fabric could increase the cost of a US-made shirt from $42 to $105 for brands, leading to retail prices rising from $175 to $263. This cost escalation has driven companies to invest in US-based manufacturing to avoid such premiums. Case study: American Giant and domestic sourcing. American Giant, a prominent advocate for US-made apparel, exemplifies the reshoring trend. The company produces casual wardrobe staples using cotton grown, woven, and sewn in North Carolina. Its partnership with Walmart allowed it to scale production and offer competitively priced products, such as a $12.98 t-shirt, by leveraging a fully domestic supply chain. CEO Bayard Winthrop has noted that tariffs, if applied judiciously, could further incentivize such domestic production. However, he also expressed concerns about the chaotic implementation of the 2025 tariffs, which created uncertainty and froze capital markets, hindering long-term investment in domestic manufacturing. American Giant's strategy involves sourcing all components domestically, which insulates it from tariff-related cost increases on imported materials. However, the company still faces challenges from reduced consumer spending due to higher prices across the market. As Winthrop noted, if tariffs cause the cost of commodities to increase, we'll likely see consumers tighten their belts, reducing demand for discretionary purchases like apparel. This highlights a dual impact of tariffs: while they encourage reshoring, they also risk dampening consumer demand due to higher prices. Case study: Nike's shift to Vietnam and Bangladesh. In contrast, global apparel giant Nike has faced significant disruptions due to tariffs on Chinese textiles. The company, which relies heavily on Asian manufacturing, experienced delays after shifting production to suppliers in Vietnam and Bangladesh to avoid Chinese tariffs. These transitions, while strategic, required significant capital investment and time, with Nike reportedly investing over $1 billion in Indian manufacturing facilities since 2023. The shift underscores the complexity of rerouting supply chains, as new suppliers often lack the infrastructure and scale of Chinese manufacturers, leading to production bottlenecks and increased costs. Nike's experience illustrates the broader challenges of reshoring in the apparel industry. While tariffs incentivize domestic production, the U.S. lacks the extensive supplier ecosystem for textiles that Asia has developed over decades. Rebuilding this ecosystem requires significant investment in infrastructure, workforce training, and technology, which can take years to achieve. Strategies for reshoring in apparel. To adapt to tariff pressures, apparel brands are employing several strategies. Domestic sourcing. Companies like Vermont Flannel are working with U.S. factories to produce fabric domestically, reducing reliance on imported materials subject to tariffs. For instance, Vermont Flannel's collaboration with a North Carolina factory aims to replace imported Portuguese cloth, though this increases production costs. Automation and technology. To offset higher U.S. labor costs, apparel manufacturers are investing in automation. A CNBC supply chain survey found that 81% of companies considering reshoring would prioritize automation over human labor to maintain cost competitiveness. Nearshoring. Some brands are relocating production to countries like Mexico, which face lower tariffs under the USMCA, as a middle ground between Asian manufacturing and full reshoring. Strategic messaging. Smaller manufacturers are leveraging "Made in the USA" branding to differentiate their products, emphasizing tariff-free production as a competitive advantage. Challenges and consumer impact. Despite these efforts, reshoring in the apparel industry faces significant hurdles. The high cost of U.S. labor and the lack of a robust domestic textile supply chain remain barriers. According to Abe Eshkenazi, CEO of the Association for Supply Chain Management, apparel manufacturing is extremely fickle due to labor costs, and younger workers are less interested in manual production jobs. Additionally, consumer prices for apparel rose by 3.5% in 2024 due to tariff-driven cost increases, eroding purchasing power and potentially reducing demand. The apparel industry's experience reflects a broader trend. Tariffs are pushing companies toward domestic production, but the transition is costly, time-consuming, and fraught with logistical challenges. While brands like American Giant demonstrate the potential for success, the industry as a whole must navigate a complex landscape of rising costs and consumer behavior shifts. Broader impacts of tariffs on American manufacturing. Transformation of manufacturing processes. Tariffs have forced American manufacturers across industries to overhaul their production processes to adapt to new cost structures and supply chain realities. Key transformations include supply chain diversification. Manufacturers are diversifying suppliers to reduce reliance on tariff-affected countries. For example, electronics manufacturers are sourcing components from Vietnam and India to avoid Chinese tariffs, though these transitions often involve delays and higher costs. Automation and digitalization. To mitigate higher input costs and labor expenses, manufacturers are investing in robotics, AI-enabled quality control, and smart factory technologies. The demand for such solutions has surged, with providers of automation technologies reporting growing interest from manufacturers. Lean manufacturing. Companies are implementing lean principles to optimize production processes and offset raw material cost increases. This includes streamlining operations and reducing waste to maintain profitability. Localized production. Tariffs have incentivized nearshoring and reshoring to shorten supply chains and improve responsiveness to market demands. This is particularly evident in industries like electronics, where companies are building domestic facilities to avoid import duties. These changes require significant capital investment and long-term planning, which constrain smaller manufacturers. Large enterprises may absorb costs or pass them on to consumers, but small manufacturers, which account for most of the U.S. sector, often face layoffs or closures if demand falls. Cost implications. Tariffs have significantly increased manufacturing costs across industries due to higher prices for imported raw materials and components. Key cost impacts include steel and aluminum. The 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum have led to price increases of 10 to 25% for key inputs, affecting industries like automotive, construction, and packaging. U.S. steel benchmarks are now roughly twice world prices, with hot-rolled coil at $900 per ton compared to a global export price of $450. Semiconductors and electronics. Tariffs on Chinese components, including printed circuit boards, PCBs, and semiconductors, have raised production costs for electronics manufacturers. The Consumer Technology Association estimates that laptop prices could rise by up to 45% due to combined tariffs. Consumer goods. The Tax Foundation estimates that 2025 tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,300 per U.S. household, with consumer goods prices rising due to higher input costs. This has a cascading effect, as manufacturers pass on costs to maintain margins, potentially reducing consumer demand. These cost increases have forced manufacturers to make tough choices. Absorb costs and reduce margins, pass costs to consumers and risk lower demand, or invest in domestic production to avoid tariffs. Output and economic impacts. The impact of tariffs on manufacturing output varies by industry. While some sectors benefit from increased domestic demand, others face reduced output due to higher costs and supply chain disruptions. Key observations include: increased domestic production. Tariffs have boosted demand for American-made goods in some sectors. For instance, the 2018 tariffs on washing machines led Asian manufacturers like Samsung and LG to establish U.S. factories, increasing domestic production and prompting U.S. manufacturers to improve competitiveness. Supply chain disruptions. Tariffs have caused volatility in supply chains, with sudden changes in demand and delays in customs clearance. This has led to production delays and material shortages, particularly in electronics and automotive sectors. Economic uncertainty. The uncertainty surrounding tariff policies has depressed business sentiment, reducing investment and hiring. J.P. Morgan Global Research predicts a potential recession due to a sentiment shock affecting business spending. Industry-specific examples. U.S. steel production. Tariffs on Chinese imports have significantly boosted U.S. steel production by making imported steel less competitive. In 2021, domestic steel capacity utilization reached 80%, driven by earlier Section 232 tariffs. The 2025 tariffs, which increased to 50% on steel and aluminum, have further incentivized domestic production, with over $10 billion committed to new mills. However, downstream industries like automotive and construction face higher costs, with reported price increases of 10 to 25% for steel inputs, thinning margins and raising consumer prices. For example, the construction industry, which relies heavily on fabricated structural steel, has seen cost hikes that increase the price of home building. Similarly, automakers like General Motors and Ford face rising costs for steel and aluminum components, potentially leading to higher vehicle prices and reduced consumer demand. Despite these challenges, U.S. steel producers benefit from a competitive advantage, as tariffs protect them from cheaper imports and encourage investment in domestic capacity. Domestic semiconductor investment. The semiconductor industry has seen a surge in domestic investment, driven by tariffs and government incentives like the 2022 CHIPS Act. Tariffs on Chinese semiconductors, ranging from 25% to 60%, have increased the cost of imported chips, prompting companies to invest in U.S. manufacturing. NVIDIA's $500 billion commitment to build AI chip manufacturing facilities in the U.S. and Apple's $500 billion investment in domestic production are notable examples. The CHIPS Act has further fueled this trend, providing incentives for semiconductor fabrication plants, fabs. According to the Reshoring Initiative, electronics and electrical products, including semiconductors, accounted for 39% of reshoring jobs announced in 2023. However, rebuilding the semiconductor supply chain domestically is complex, as it requires not only fabs but also suppliers for packaging, materials, and chemicals. The transition is expected to take 6 to 10 years, with short-term disruptions due to reliance on foreign components.